Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're jumping into a really thought-provoking part of a newly revised book by Steve Brown. It's called Call 911, I've Been Shot Mentally and Financially. And we're looking specifically at Chapter 2, Halftime Adjustments.
Yeah, it's a great chapter. It basically asks you to pause, look at the first half of your life, however long that's been,
Right.
and really think about what adjustments you need to make for the second half.
It uses this sports analogy, like a coach stepping back at halftime, which I think is really effective. It's about making conscious choices.
Exactly. Not just letting things happen, but actively deciding, taking responsibility.
And for anyone listening who thinks this sounds relevant, the book, Call 911, I've Been Shot Mentally and Financially, is out now. You can find it on Amazon Kindle, hardcover, softcover. It's published by Beginning to End Publishing Company.
And it's powerful stuff. If you've ever felt, stuck or like you're repeating the same mistakes, this chapter hits home.
Okay, so let's get into it. The first big idea is this need for an honest look back. Why is looking at the past so important before moving forward?
Well, the chapter argues pretty strongly that if you don't understand what went wrong, or maybe even what went right, in the first half, you're likely just going to repeat those patterns, good or bad, without even realizing it. You need that awareness first.
And it tackles the blame game head on, doesn't it? The book says, sitting around and blaming others for where you are won't change anything.
That's a central point. Blaming, whether it's parents, circumstances, whatever, it essentially makes you powerless.
How so?
Because you're giving away your control. By saying it's their fault, you're also saying, I can't fix it. Taking responsibility, even for your part in things, gives you back that power, that agency.
The book mentions some, let's say, high-profile examples of blame shifting, like George W. Bush and the Iraq weapons inspector situation.
Right. And the point isn't really about the politics of that specific event.
Oh.
It's more about using it as an illustration of how easily blame can become the narrative. Maybe obscuring a more complex reality, or obscuring one's own choices in the matter.
So it's prompting you, the reader, to think about where you might be doing that in your own life.
Exactly. Where might you be simplifying things by pointing fingers?
It also brings up Hillary Clinton's vote versus her later statements on the Iraq War, calling it lying and blaming. And then there's a James Carville analogy about basketball rules in Louisiana. Seems like a bit of a mix.
Yeah, they're diverse examples, but I think they all circle back to this theme: how blame operates, how narratives shift, how external rules might change. But ultimately, the book pushes you towards focusing on your own actions and adjustments within whatever context you find yourself. Recognize the pattern, essentially.
Yeah, that makes sense. So once you start taking responsibility, the chapter talks about learning from observation, looking at others.
Yes. Observing the long-term outcomes of choices other people have made. It's like getting a sneak peek at potential futures.
So looking at maybe older people who've had certain habits for years, drinking, smoking, maybe even excessive online time.
Precisely. What does that look like down the road? You can learn from their trajectory without having to live it yourself.
And it applies this to careers too, right? Asking if you really want your boss's job, considering the whole package, not just the title.
Does the increased responsibility come with rewards that align with your definition of a good life? Or is it just more pressure without the fulfillment? Observing helps clarify that.
Now, the chapter taps into something I think many people feel, this sense of being stuck with a lousy first half, even if maybe they're doing okay on paper.
Yeah, that feeling of underachievement. It lists some common reasons: procrastination, self-doubt,
Poor decisions, hanging with the wrong crowd.
bad habits, getting buried in debt. All those things that can make you feel like you're just spinning your wheels.
Especially the debt part. Working just to pay bills, feeling like you have nothing to show for it, that's a tough cycle.
It really is. Yeah. But the message here, and this is key in Call 911, is that it doesn't have to be your story forever. The second half can be different.
It uses a Stephen Colbert quote about credit cards, and Steve Brown shares his own story about bad credit too, doesn't he?
Yeah, to hammer home that taking financial responsibility is a huge part of breaking free. It's about making conscious changes.
And there's even a mention of Barack Obama's budget proposal and the deficit as a larger scale example of things getting out of hand without adjustments.
Right. It reinforces the idea that inaction or repeating failed strategies has consequences, whether personal or national.
Which leads perfectly into the next point. The danger of running the same plays over and over, like that football coach example. Why do we keep making the same mistakes?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Habit, fear, maybe just not taking the time to do that halftime reflection we talked about.
The book really makes you think with that question. If you knew 10 years ago where you'd be today, would you change things?
Ooh, it's confronting. And then it flips it. If you change nothing now, how will you feel in 10 years looking back at today? It's a call to action, really.
Now let's talk about redefining success. The chapter challenges the traditional view, the high-powered job, the big income.
Yeah, it asked about the cost of that traditional success. The long hours, the potential impact on family, on health. Is that trade-off worth it for you?
It uses the example of kids growing up and needing you differently. Time you can't get back.
And the hypothetical successful guy who feels empty because he ignored his passions.
So, is he really successful? That's the question it poses.
Right. Does external success matter if you're not fulfilled? The chapter suggests true success involves feeling whole, content, peace with your choices.
Okay, so we've reflected, taken responsibility, maybe redefined success, but actually making changes can be scary. The chapter addresses fear and regret.
Absolutely. Fear is a huge barrier. Fear of failing, fear of the unknown. But the book flips it. Quoting FDR, the only thing to fear is fear itself. It argues inaction fueled by fear is often the bigger risk.
The risk of looking back with regret later on.
Exactly. And it talks about courage not being the absence of fear, but acting despite it.
And it's pretty blunt about dwelling on the past, isn't it?
Very. Quit harping on past mistakes, it says. You can't change yesterday. Focus on today.
And that quote about discipline versus regret is powerful. The pain of discipline weighs ounces. The pain of regret weighs tons.
That sums it up perfectly. Acting now, even when it's hard, is far less painful in the long run than living with the regret of not having tried. Carlene Bryce's quote reinforces that act today.
Chapter 2 kind of wraps up with a couple of later quotes from Ronald Reagan and Rodney Dangerfield.
Yeah, a little humor after some pretty deep self-examination. A nice touch.
So pulling it all together, what's the big takeaway from Chapter 2 of Steve Brown's Call 911, I've Been Shot Mentally and Financially?
I think it's fundamentally an empowering message. It's saying, look back honestly, learn the lessons, take the wheel now, and consciously choose the direction for your second half. It's an opportunity.
And it really feels timely that Steve Brown re-released this book now, after 20 years. It suggests he feels these ideas are maybe even more relevant for us in 2025.
I'd agree. The challenges might look a bit different, but the core principles of reflection and responsibility are timeless.
So congratulations again to Steve Brown on the re-release. And remember, Call 911, I've Been Shot Mentally and Financially is available on Amazon Kindle, hardcover, softcover, published by Beginning to End Publishing Company.
Definitely worth checking out if any of this resonated.
Absolutely. So our final thought for you, listener, reflecting on this chapter, what's maybe one halftime adjustment, big or small, that you feel inspired to consider making in your own life? Something to think about. Thanks for joining our deep dive today.